Cops laughed as I bled out, thinking I was worthless. But I was an undercover detective. The taste of copper filled my mouth as I pressed my face against the cold concrete, trying to breathe through what felt like broken ribs. Blood pooled beneath my cheek, mixing with the grime and trash scattered across the alley floor. My left eye was swollen shut, and every shallow breath sent lightning bolts of pain through my chest. 3 months. 3 months I'd been living this lie, letting my beard grow wild, wearing the same torn jacket day after day, sleeping in doorways and eating scraps. Detective Marcus Rivera had become Mark the Vagrant so completely that sometimes I forgot which version was real. The department brass had warned me this deep cover assignment would be brutal, but I'd volunteered anyway. Someone had to get close enough to Tony Castellano's crew to gather evidence of their money laundering operation. I'd gotten close, all right. Close enough that when Tony suspected I was asking too many questions about their Tuesday night poker games at the warehouse, he'd sent his boys to teach me a lesson. Vince had held me down while Tommy worked me over with brass knuckles, making sure to hit spots that wouldn't show. Except they'd miscalculated, or maybe they'd meant to leave me here to die. The sound of footsteps echoed off the brick walls, accompanied by the crackle of police radios. Finally. Someone must have called in a disturbance. Jesus, look at this mess, a voice said. Officer Patterson, I realized, recognizing the nasal tone even through my haze of pain. I'd worked with him 2 years ago on a domestic violence case. Patterson, I wheezed, trying to lift my head. It's me. Detective Rivera. Badge number 4-4-7-9. Heavy boots stopped just inches from my face. What's this piece of trash mumbling about? Please, I gasped, tasting fresh blood. Internal injuries, need paramedics. A second voice joined in, Officer Kyle Morrison, based on the slight southern drawl. Sounds like he's claiming to be a cop. Probably watched too many episodes of Law and Order in whatever flophouse he crawled out of. My vision blurred as I tried to focus on their faces. Morrison was young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of cocky smile that said he'd never met a rule he couldn't bend. Patterson was older, seasoned enough to know better. They both should have recognized protocol. Injured person requests medical attention, you call it in. No questions asked. Badge, in my jacket, I managed, my words slurred but distinct. Call Lieutenant Sarah Chin, she'll verify. Morrison crouched down, his knee splashing in a puddle of my blood. Listen here, junkie. I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but pretending to be police. That's a felony. Not pretending, I whispered, fighting to stay conscious. The pain in my chest was getting worse, each breath more difficult than the last. Undercover, 3 months, please just call it in. Patterson laughed, actually laughed. The sound bounced off the alley walls like broken glass. Undercover as what? Professional bum. You've definitely mastered that role. My phone. If I could reach my burner phone, I could call Chin directly. My right arm felt like it was on fire, but I managed to inch it toward my pocket. Morrison saw the movement and stepped on my wrist, grinding his boot heel into the bones. Stay still, Detective Dumpster Dive, he sneered. We're just getting started with you. That's when I realized they weren't going to help me. These weren't officers responding to an emergency, they were predators who'd found wounded prey. The radio on Patterson's belt crackled to life. Unit 23, what's your status on the disturbance call at Maple and 3rd? Patterson unclipped the radio, his eyes never leaving me. Unit 23 to dispatch. False alarm. Just another homeless vagrant who got into a scuffle. Probably fighting over a bottle. Copy that. Need medical assistance. I tried to shout, to make any sound loud enough for the dispatcher to hear, but all that came out was a wet gurgle. Morrison pressed his boot harder into my wrist, and I heard something crack. Negative on medical, Patterson replied smoothly. Subject appears intoxicated and belligerent. We'll handle it. The radio went silent. My lifeline to help had just been severed by 2 words, false alarm. You know what I think? Morrison said, finally lifting his boot off my arm. I think this junkie tried to break into that warehouse over there, got his ass kicked by the owners, and now he's making up stories to avoid getting arrested for B&E. Blood was pooling in my mouth faster now. Internal bleeding, definitely. I had maybe an hour before shock set in completely. Lieutenant Chin, I whispered again, hoping the name would trigger some recognition. Sarah Chin, Major Crimes Division. Call her. Please. Sarah Chin. Patterson's eyebrows shot up. You mean that ball-busting lieutenant who transferred in from Chicago last year? Now I know you're full of shit. What would a detective working under Chin be doing in this rat-infested neighborhood? If only I could tell them about Operation Nightfall, about the 18 months of investigation that had led to my assignment. About the evidence I'd already gathered on Tony Castellano's crew washing money through their construction company front. But operational security meant I couldn't reveal details, even to other cops. Especially not like this. Check, my prints, I managed. Detective Marcus Rivera, Major Crimes. Started with NYPD in 2019. Morrison pulled out his phone and took a picture of my bloodied face. This'll be great for the group chat. Local crackhead thinks he's detective. Boys back at the station will love this. My heart sank. Not only were they refusing to help, they were documenting their cruelty. Evidence of their misconduct, but I'd have to survive long enough for it to matter. Patterson knelt beside me, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath. Here's what's going to happen, Detective Rivera. We're going to sit here for a while and let you think about the consequences of impersonating a police officer. Maybe by the time we're done, you'll remember who you really are and stop wasting our time with these elaborate fantasies. 20 minutes, Morrison added, checking his watch. That's how long we've got before we need to clear for our next call. Think our friend here will come to his senses by then. 20 minutes. In my current condition, 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours. I could feel my strength ebbing with each heartbeat, my vision growing darker around the edges. The metallic taste in my mouth was getting stronger, and my left lung felt like it was filling with fluid. But something Patterson said sparked a memory. Group chat. These two weren't just negligent, they were part of something bigger. A culture of cruelty that treated certain citizens as less than human. I had to survive this. Not just for myself, but for every person who'd been dismissed, mocked, and abandoned by officers who'd forgotten their oath to protect and serve. The sound of another patrol car pulling up made my heart leap with desperate hope. Fresh officers meant a fresh chance at getting help. Maybe these new arrivals would actually follow protocol. What we got here? The voice belonged to Sergeant Rick Kowalski, a 20-year veteran I'd met during a joint task force meeting last spring. He'd seemed decent then, professional. Surely he'd recognize proper procedure. "Hey Sarge," Patterson called out, not even bothering to move away from where I lay bleeding. "Just some vagrant who took a beating. Claims he's an undercover detective." He said the last part with exaggerated air quotes. I mustered every ounce of strength I had left. "Sergeant Kowalski," I croaked, loud enough to be heard. "Detective Marcus Rivera, Shield 4479. Call Lieutenant Chen for verification." Kowalski's boots appeared in my limited field of vision as he approached. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker across his face, recognition, maybe. But it vanished as quickly as it came. "Rivera?" Kowalski scratched his chin thoughtfully. "You know, that name does sound familiar." My pulse quickened. Finally, someone was listening. "But Detective Rivera is that clean-cut Hispanic guy from Major Crimes," Kowalski continued, crushing my hopes. "About 6 foot, maybe 180 pounds. Always wears those expensive suits. This piece of garbage looks like he hasn't seen a shower in months." That's the point," I gasped, each word in agony. "Deep cover, 3 months, warehouse operation." Morrison laughed so hard he had to steady himself against the brick wall. "Oh man, now he's got details. A warehouse operation. Sarge, I think we got ourselves the next Serpico here." But something in Kowalski's expression had changed. He was studying my face more carefully now, and I saw his eyes narrow. Not with recognition, with something worse. Calculation. "You know what?" Kowalski said slowly, "Maybe we should take a closer look at this guy. Pat him down, check for ID." Hope flared in my chest again, but it died when I saw the look that passed between the 3 officers. This wasn't about helping me. This was about covering their bases. Patterson's hands were rough as he searched my jacket pockets, pulling out my burner phone, the small roll of cash Tony had paid me for moving packages, and finally, my fake ID. The one that identified me as Mark Russo, unemployed, no fixed address. Well, Patterson announced, holding up the ID. "Looks like our detective is actually Mark Russo. Funny how that works." "Check the phone," I wheezed. "Recent calls. Lieutenant Chen's number." Morrison snatched the phone from Patterson's hands. "Password protected. Convenient." He made a show of trying a few obvious combinations before shaking his head. "Nope. Guess we'll never know who this crackhead's been calling." But I could see the screen from where I lay, and I watched Morrison's face change as he scrolled through my call log. Even password-protected phones showed recent calls on the lock screen. He was seeing Lieutenant Chen's number, Captain Walsh's number, the secure line for Operation Nightfall. He was seeing proof that everything I'd told them was true. Morrison's eyes met Kowalski's, and some silent communication passed between them. The sergeant stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Here's the situation, boys," Kowalski said quietly, but not quietly enough. "We've got ourselves what you might call a delicate situation. Now, I'm not saying I believe this junkie's story, but..." He trailed off, letting the implications hang in the air. I realized with growing horror that they were discussing what to do about me. Not how to help me, but how to manage the risk I represented. The pain in my chest was getting worse, my vision tunneling. I was running out of time, and these 3 officers were running out of ways to explain why they'd let a detective bleed to death in an alley. "You know what the real problem is here?" Kowalski said, his voice taking on a philosophical tone that chilled me to the bone. "False accusations against police officers. Career-ending stuff, even when it's complete bullshit." Morrison nodded eagerly. "Exactly. Some junkie claims we didn't help him, suddenly we're the bad guys. Internal Affairs loves that kind of drama." My blood felt like ice despite the warm September night. They weren't just discussing covering their tracks, they were actively planning it. The phone in Morrison's hand contained evidence that could destroy their narrative, and they knew it. "Hand me that," Kowalski ordered, gesturing toward the device. Morrison passed it over, and I watched helplessly as the sergeant examined the screen. His weathered face remained impassive, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes as he scrolled through my recent calls. "Interesting contact list," he murmured. "Very interesting." A fresh wave of pain crashed through my chest, and I coughed up what looked like coffee grounds, blood that had been sitting in my stomach. Internal bleeding was accelerating. Maybe 30 minutes left before I'd lose consciousness permanently. "Listen carefully, Mark," Kowalski said, crouching down beside me. He deliberately used the name from my fake ID. "I've been doing this job for 20 years. Seen every scam, every con, every desperate attempt to avoid consequences. You want to know what I think happened here?" I tried to speak, but only managed a wet wheeze. "I think you're a small-time dealer who got beaten up by your suppliers for skimming product. Happens all the time in this neighborhood. And now you're panicking, trying to come up with some elaborate story to explain why you had Lieutenant Chen's number in your phone." "How?" I gasped. The word came out as barely a whisper, but Kowalski heard it. "How did you get her number?" He smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen on a cop's face. "Maybe you overhead it at the courthouse. Maybe you followed some detective into a bar and heard him making a call. Hell, maybe you found it written on a bathroom wall. Point is, having someone's phone number doesn't make you a police officer." Patterson laughed appreciatively. "That's good, Sarge. Real good. Junkie overhears Chen's number somewhere, memorizes it, thinks it makes him sound credible." But Morrison looked uncomfortable. "What about the badge number he gave?" 4479. "Easy enough to find online," Kowalski replied smoothly. "Police roster information gets leaked all the time. Some website probably has every active detective's badge number posted. I wanted to scream that they were wrong, that no such database existed, that badge numbers were specifically kept confidential to prevent exactly this kind of impersonation. But my voice was failing along with everything else. Kowalski stood up, brushing dirt off his knees. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to call this in as an assault victim who's become combative and delusional due to his injuries. Happens all the time with head trauma. EMTs will understand why it took us extra time to secure the scene safely. How much extra time? Patterson asked. Kowalski checked his watch. Well, we've been here about 25 minutes now. I'd say another 15 ought to do it. Give our friend here time to calm down and stop making wild accusations. 15 more minutes. I did the math through my haze of pain and despair. They'd already wasted nearly half an hour, and they planned to waste 15 more. By the time paramedics arrived, I'd either be unconscious or dead. Either way, I wouldn't be able to repeat my claims about being an undercover detective. Morrison was staring at my phone screen again. Sarge, there's something else. Multiple calls to a number listed as warehouse contact. Today's date, too. My heart sank. That was Tony Castellano's burner phone. The calls I'd made earlier, trying to set up tonight's meeting that had gone so catastrophically wrong. In the hands of dirty cops, that contact information could be twisted into evidence supporting their dealer theory. Perfect, Kowalski said, taking the phone back. Our victim here was involved in some kind of drug transaction that went bad. Explains the beating, explains why he's so desperate to avoid honest questions about what happened. What about Lieutenant Chen's number? Morrison pressed. Unrelated coincidence. Or maybe our boy Mark here was planning to file a false complaint against some detective named Rivera. Frame an innocent cop to cover his own crimes. Kowalski's voice grew harder. You know how many good officers have had their careers destroyed by lying criminals? How many families torn apart by false accusations? The twisted logic was almost impressive. They were constructing an entire alternative narrative that painted me as the villain and themselves as heroes protecting their fellow officers from a scheming junkie. Every piece of evidence that should have proven my identity was being reframed as proof of my guilt. Patterson's radio crackled again. Unit 23, status update. Unit 23, still on scene. Subject remains agitated and non-cooperative. Requesting EMT response for transport to General Hospital psychiatric evaluation. Copy. EMT dispatched, ETA 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Not the 15 Kowalski had mentioned, but close enough. They'd managed to delay my medical treatment for nearly 40 minutes while constructing their cover story. By the time I reached the hospital, any claims I made about being an undercover detective would be dismissed as head injury delusions or psychological breakdown. Unless someone came looking for me first. The distant rumble of another vehicle approaching made all three officers tense. But this wasn't the EMT unit, the engine sound was wrong, too powerful and aggressive. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the mouth of the alley, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Shit, Morrison muttered, instinctively moving his hand closer to his weapon. That's not one of ours. My heart hammered against my broken ribs as the SUV's doors opened. Tony Castellano stepped out first, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the asphalt. Behind him came Vince and Tommy, the same two who'd worked me over an hour ago. They must have come back to finish the job. Evening, officers, Tony called out, his voice carrying that deceptively friendly tone I'd learned to fear over the past 3 months. Hope we're not interrupting anything important. Kowalski stepped forward, his hand resting on his service weapon. This is a crime scene, sir. You need to move along. Tony's laugh echoed off the brick walls. Crime scene. That's interesting. His eyes found me lying in a puddle of blood and debris. Because that piece of garbage there. He's been asking a lot of questions about my business. The kind of questions that make a man wonder if maybe the rats have found their way into his operation. The three officers exchanged glances, and I could practically see the wheels turning in their heads. They were realizing that their carefully constructed narrative about a drug deal gone wrong might be closer to the truth than they'd intended, just not in the way they'd planned. You know this individual? Patterson asked, gesturing toward me. Oh, we're acquainted, Tony replied smoothly. Mark Russo, right? Been hanging around the neighborhood for a few months, always eager to earn a few dollars running errands. Problem is, Mark's been running his mouth to people he shouldn't be talking to. My blood turned to ice water. If Tony suspected I was law enforcement strongly enough to come back and eliminate me, that meant my cover was blown completely. 3 months of careful work, dozens of recorded conversations, financial records I'd photographed, all of it compromised. What kind of people? Kowalski asked, and I caught something in his tone. Interest, but not the kind a clean cop should have when questioning a potential witness. Tony smiled, pulling out an expensive cigar and taking his time lighting it. The kind that wear badges, Sergeant. Amazing how many cops are interested in my legitimate construction business lately. Vince cracked his knuckles loudly. Boss, you want us to finish what we started? Looks like the job's only half done. Now hold on, Morrison interrupted, but his voice lacked conviction. This man is injured and in police custody. Whatever business you have with him will have to wait until... Until what? Tony interrupted, blowing a stream of smoke toward the darkening sky. Until he wakes up in a hospital bed and starts telling stories about my associates. About conversations he might have overheard. About financial records he might have seen. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. I realized with growing horror that these weren't random dirty cops, they were connected. The way Kowalski held himself, the careful neutrality in his voice, the fact that none of them seemed surprised by Tony's appearance. This wasn't coincidence. How long has he been unconscious? Tony asked casually, as if inquiring about the weather. He's been drifting in and out, Patterson replied. Took a pretty serious beating. Probably won't remember much of anything that happened tonight. Memory's a fragile thing, Tony agreed, studying the glowing tip of his cigar. Head injuries can cause all kinds of confusion. Make a man think he remembers conversations that never happened, meetings that never took place. Tragic, really. Tommy stepped closer, and I could see the brass knuckles still wrapped around his right hand. Want me to make sure his memory stays nice and fuzzy, boss? My vision was narrowing to a tunnel, consciousness slipping away despite my desperate attempts to stay alert. But I could still hear them negotiating my fate like I was already dead. EMT's going to be here in 8 minutes, Kowalski said quietly. Whatever you're planning to do, it needs to be fast and clean. Or, Tony said thoughtfully, we could let nature take its course. Internal injuries are unpredictable things. Sometimes people don't make it to the hospital, despite everyone's best efforts to save them. The radio on Patterson's belt crackled one more time. Unit 23, be advised we have a Detective Chin requesting your location for a welfare check on a Detective Rivera. Please respond. The color drained from Kowalski's face. The silence that followed Chen's radio call was deafening. I watched through my swollen eye as the 3 officers and Tony's crew processed what they'd just heard. Detective Chin wasn't just a random name I'd pulled from memory, she was actively looking for me. Shit, Morrison whispered, his earlier cockiness evaporating. She's looking for Rivera specifically. Kowalski's hand moved to his radio, but he didn't key it immediately. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how to spin this new development. Tony, meanwhile, had gone very still, his cigar forgotten between his fingers. Interesting timing, Tony said slowly. How long since you boys first arrived on scene? 37 minutes, Patterson replied automatically, then seemed to realize what he just admitted. 37 minutes without calling for medical assistance, without following basic protocol for an injured civilian. My heart hammered weakly against my broken ribs. Chen knew I was missing. The welfare check meant someone had expected me to report in and I hadn't. Maybe my handler had gotten worried when I missed my scheduled check-in at 9 p.m. It was currently 9:23 according to Morrison's watch. Unit 23, please respond immediately, the dispatcher's voice crackled again, more urgent this time. Detective Chen is en route to your location. How far out is she? Vince asked, his hand moving inside his jacket. Kowalski keyed his radio with shaking fingers. Unit 23 to dispatch. We're dealing with an uncooperative subject. Scene isn't secure yet for additional personnel. Copy that. Detective Chen advised she's 3 minutes from your location with backup units. 3 minutes. I tried to speak, to make some sound that would carry over the radio, but all that came out was a wet gurgle. Blood was filling my mouth faster now, and each breath felt like drowning from the inside. Boss, we need to go, Tommy said urgently. If that Chen bitch shows up and sees us here. Nobody's going anywhere yet, Tony cut him off, but I could hear the strain in his voice. 37 minutes these officers have been here, and somehow they forgot to call an ambulance for a beaten man. That's interesting police work, don't you think? The threat was clear. Tony had leverage over these cops now, evidence of their misconduct that he could use to destroy their careers. But it also meant he had 3 corrupt officers in his pocket for as long as they all kept each other's secrets. What do you want? Kowalski asked, his 20 years of experience finally showing through the panic. I want assurance that our friend Mark here won't remember any details about his unfortunate accident. Head trauma can cause all kinds of memory problems. Tony's smile was cold as winter steel. And I want confirmation that certain financial records he might have photographed were never actually photographed at all. My heart sank. Tony knew exactly what I'd been doing. 3 months of careful surveillance, and somehow he'd figured it out. The photos I'd taken of their money laundering ledgers, the recordings of their Tuesday night planning sessions, all of it compromised. We can make that happen, Patterson said quickly. Guy like this, history of drug problems, unreliable witness anyway. I don't have a drug problem, I managed to whisper, the words barely audible. But Kowalski heard me. Head injuries making him delusional, he announced loudly, for Tony's benefit and for any recording devices that might be active. Classic symptom. Probably won't remember his own name by tomorrow. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the night air. Multiple vehicles, coming fast. Chen wasn't taking any chances, she was bringing cavalry. Vince, Tommy, back to the car. Now. Tony dropped his cigar and crushed it under his heel. Officers, I trust you'll handle this situation with appropriate discretion. What about Rivera? Morrison asked desperately. When Chen gets here. Rivera's not here, Tony said simply. There's just Mark Russo, a vagrant who got beaten up during a drug transaction. A man with no credibility, no connections, and unfortunately, significant head trauma that's affected his memory and judgment. As Tony's SUV roared away into the night, I realized the full scope of what was happening. These officers weren't just covering up their misconduct, they were actively participating in destroying a detective and burying a major investigation. The evidence I gathered on Tony's operation would disappear along with my credibility. Unless Chen arrived in time to save more than just my life. The sirens were getting louder, maybe 2 blocks away. Kowalski was speaking rapidly into his radio, setting up the narrative that would explain everything. A confused vagrant claiming to be a detective. Head injuries causing delusions. Officers who'd done their best to help an uncooperative subject. It might actually work. The first patrol car screeched around the corner with Chen's unmarked sedan right behind it. Even through my failing vision, I could see her distinctive silhouette as she stepped out, tall, authoritative, wearing the same navy blazer she'd had on during our last briefing 4 days ago. Where's Detective Rivera? Chen's voice cut through the night air like a blade. Kowalski stepped forward, his hands raised in a calming gesture. Ma'am, I'm not sure what you're referring to. We've been dealing with an injured vagrant who's been making some pretty wild claims. Bullshit. Chen's response was immediate and harsh. She pushed past the 3 officers and knelt beside me, her trained eyes taking in the extent of my injuries. Jesus Christ, Marcus. What did they do to you? Relief flooded through me so powerfully I nearly lost consciousness. She recognized me. Despite 3 months of beard growth, despite the blood and swelling, despite the filthy clothes, she knew who I was. Lieutenant, I whispered, each word in agony. Operation, compromised. Tony knows. Save your strength, she said firmly, then spun to face Kowalski. How long has he been like this? Ma'am, this individual has been claiming to be Detective Rivera, but... Sergeant Kowalski. Chen's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper as she stood up. That is Detective Marcus Rivera, badge 4479, assigned to Operation Nightfall under my direct command. He's been undercover for 14 weeks gathering evidence on the Castellano money laundering network. And you've left him bleeding in an alley for over 40 minutes. The color completely drained from Patterson's face. Morrison actually took a step backward, his hand trembling near his radio. We didn't know, Patterson stammered. He looked like exactly what he was supposed to look like, Chen snapped. That's the point of deep cover, Officer Patterson. Though I'm wondering how 3 experienced officers failed to recognize basic protocol when an injured man requested medical attention. Backup officers were spreading out around the scene now, and I recognized Lieutenant Rodriguez from Internal Affairs stepping out of an unmarked car. This wasn't just a welfare check anymore, this was a full investigation being launched in real time. Chen knelt beside me again, her voice softer. Marcus, I need you to tell me what happened. The beating, the officer's response, everything you can remember. Tony's crew, I managed, fighting through the haze of pain. Vince and Tommy. They suspected, came back 20 minutes ago. Talked to the officers, they know each other. I watched Chen's expression change as the implications hit her. This wasn't just negligence, this was potential corruption involving active duty officers and organized crime figures. Lieutenant Rodriguez, Chen called out sharply. I need these 3 officers separated immediately. No communication between them until we can conduct formal interviews. Wait just a minute, Kowalski protested. We responded to a call, found an injured subject, followed standard procedure. Standard procedure is to call an ambulance immediately, Rodriguez interrupted, consulting his notebook. Dispatch shows your first radio contact at 8:47 p.m. reporting, false alarm, no medical needed. It's currently 9:31. That's 44 minutes of denied medical care. Morrison's radio crackled suddenly. Unit 15, be advised we have reports of a black SUV fleeing the scene at high speed. License partial reads, TGC something. Units in pursuit. TGC. Tony Giuseppe Castellano. They were chasing Tony's vehicle, which meant there might be evidence of his return to the scene. Evidence that could corroborate my account of what had really happened here. Get me those pursuit updates, Chen ordered one of the backup officers. Then she turned back to me. Marcus, did Tony say anything specific about the operation? About what he knew? Financial records, I whispered, each word getting harder to form. Photos I took, he knew about them. Said they were never actually photographed. Chen's jaw tightened. Your handler reported you missed your 9 p.m. check-in. We've been monitoring radio traffic and heard these officers report a vagrant disturbance at your last known location. The timeline was damning. My missed check-in at 9 p.m., the officer's false report, Tony's appearance and departure, it all painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond simple negligence. EMTs are 2 minutes out, Rodriguez announced. Chen, we need to preserve this scene and get statements while everything's fresh. Agreed. And Rodriguez? Chen's voice carried a weight that made everyone stop talking. I want a full investigation into how Tony Castellano knew to come here tonight. Either we have a leak in the department, or these officers made contact with him directly. As the sirens grew louder, I realized that surviving this beating might be just the beginning of a much larger battle. The EMT unit's flashing lights painted the alley walls in alternating red and white as the paramedics rushed toward me with their equipment. Through my swollen eye, I watched Chen step back to give them room while keeping her steely gaze fixed on the 3 officers who'd left me to die. Possible internal bleeding, definite rib fractures, suspected pneumothorax, the lead paramedic announced after his initial assessment. How long has he been down? According to these officers, approximately 45 minutes, Chen replied coldly. Despite multiple requests for medical assistance. The second paramedic looked up sharply from where he was inserting in 4 line. 45 minutes. With injuries this severe. He shot an incredulous look at Kowalski. What the hell were you people thinking? I tried to speak as they loaded me onto the gurney, but the oxygen mask they placed over my face muffled my words. Chen leaned closer, lifting the mask slightly. The warehouse, I managed to whisper. Evidence, hidden in the office safe. Combination is Tony's daughter's birthday. March 15, 2010. 31510. Chen nodded grimly, memorizing the numbers. We'll get it, Marcus. Just focus on staying with us. As they wheeled me toward the ambulance, I heard Rodriguez addressing the 3 officers. Gentlemen, you're all suspended pending investigation. Badges and weapons, now. This is bullshit, Morrison exploded. We followed protocol. Protocol. Chen spun around, her voice carrying enough fury to stop traffic. Protocol is calling an ambulance when someone's bleeding out, not standing around making jokes about one less problem on the streets. Yes, Officer Morrison, we heard that part too. My blood ran cold. They'd been monitoring radio communications, which meant they'd heard everything. The cruel laughter, the mockery, the deliberate delay in getting me help. It was all documented. Patterson tried a different approach. Lieutenant, you have to understand, we get fake claims all the time. Junkies pretending to be cops, trying to avoid arrest. Detective Rivera gave you his badge number, his lieutenant's name, and requested verification. Rodriguez cut him off. Instead of making one phone call that would have taken 30 seconds, you chose to assume he was lying and let him suffer. The ambulance doors slammed shut, cutting off the confrontation outside. As we pulled away from the alley, the lead paramedic was already on his radio coordinating with the trauma team at General Hospital. Detective Rivera, can you hear me? He asked, checking my pupil response with a small flashlight. I need you to stay conscious if possible. Your blood pressure's dropping fast. I managed a weak nod, fighting against the darkness creeping in around the edges of my vision. Through the ambulance's rear window, I could see Chen's sedan following closely behind, her emergency lights flashing. Sir, were those officers really going to let you die? The younger paramedic asked quietly, his voice filled with disgust. Before I could answer, my phone, still in Morrison's possession back at the scene, began ringing. Even from inside the moving ambulance, I could hear Chen shouting at him to answer it immediately. That's probably Captain Walsh, I wheezed, recognizing the ringtone I'd programmed for my department supervisor. He was expecting an update on the surveillance photos. The paramedic's eyes widened. You really are undercover. 3 months, I confirmed, then coughed up more blood. 3 months building this case, and those bastards almost destroyed everything because they thought I was worthless. As we raced through the city streets toward the hospital, I realized that my near-death experience had exposed something far more dangerous than Tony Castellano's money laundering operation. It had revealed a cancer within the police department itself, officers who had forgotten that every life has value, regardless of social status or appearance. The real question was how deep that cancer had spread, and whether Chen would be able to cut it out before it killed again. The trauma team at General Hospital worked on me for 3 hours. By the time I was stable enough for visitors, it was nearly 1 a.m. and Chen was pacing my ICU room like a caged predator. The warehouse was cleaned out, she said without preamble, her voice tight with frustration. Safe was empty, computers wiped, every piece of paper shredded. They had a head start thanks to your 3 guardian angels back there. I tried to sit up, immediately regretting it as pain shot through my chest. The backup drives? Gone. Tony's crew was thorough. Chen pulled a chair closer to my bed. But here's the interesting part, we ran the timeline. Castellano's people hit the warehouse at 9:15 p.m., 30 minutes before Tony showed up in that alley. Someone tipped him off the moment you were found. My blood chilled despite the warm hospital blankets. You think one of the officers called him? I think we're looking at something bigger than 3 cops with bad judgment. Chen opened her tablet, showing me a series of photographs. Remember Officer Morrison taking pictures of you for his group chat? We subpoenaed his phone records. That group chat has 47 members, Marcus. 47 officers from 6 different precincts. The implications hit me like another beating. How many of them knew about Operation Nightfall? That's what we're trying to figure out. But Morrison made 2 phone calls after finding you, one to his sergeant, and one to a number registered to Vincent Torino. Vince. Tony's enforcer, the one who'd held me down while Tommy worked me over. The same Vince who'd cracked his knuckles and offered to finish the job in that alley. Morrison's been feeding information to Tony's crew, I said, my voice hoarse from the breathing tube they removed an hour earlier. How long? Unknown. Internal Affairs is pulling his financial records now, looking for any suspicious deposits. But Marcus, there's something else. Chen's expression darkened further. Sergeant Kowalski's been taking regular payments from Castellano Construction. $2,500 every month for the past 18 months, listed as security consulting. I closed my eyes, trying to process the scope of the corruption. My entire investigation hadn't just been compromised, it had been monitored from the inside. Every move I'd made, every piece of evidence I'd gathered, Tony had known about it. The photos I took of their financial records, I said slowly. If Kowalski was reporting to them. They'd been feeding you false information for weeks. Maybe months. Chen's jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. We found modified ledgers in the warehouse debris. They were letting you photograph exactly what they wanted you to see. The betrayal cut deeper than my physical injuries. 3 months of living on the streets, eating scraps, sleeping in doorways, all of it had been theater for Tony's benefit. I'd been a puppet dancing to his tune while thinking I was conducting a covert investigation. How many cases are blown? I asked, dreading the answer. Operation Nightfall is dead. But we're auditing every case that involved those 3 officers over the past 2 years. Preliminary count shows at least 17 major investigations that might be compromised. A soft knock interrupted us. Lieutenant Rodriguez peered around the door frame, his expression grim. Chen, we've got a problem, he said. Morrison's lawyer is claiming his client was following Kowalski's direct orders. Says he has recordings that prove the sergeant instructed him to delay medical care for suspected drug dealers. Recordings? Body cam footage from all 3 officers. Morrison's attorney says it shows systematic abuse of authority, and his client was just following department culture established by senior personnel. Chen and I exchanged looks. Morrison was trying to flip the script, painting himself as a victim of corrupt leadership instead of an active participant. There's more, Rodriguez continued. Patterson's union rep is demanding the entire investigation be transferred to the FBI, claiming internal affairs is compromised because you and Rivera worked together previously. The corruption was metastasizing in real time, turning into a political battle that could destroy careers and derail justice. My near-death experience had kicked over a hornet's nest, and now everyone was scrambling to avoid getting stung. Wait, I said, struggling to sit up despite the burning in my chest. Body cam footage? If they recorded everything. Rodriguez's expression grew even grimmer. That's the problem, Marcus. The footage shows exactly what happened, but Morrison's spinning it as evidence of systemic corruption, not individual misconduct. His lawyer's claiming he was just a rookie following orders from a 20-year veteran. Chen's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. It's Captain Walsh. He's been in emergency meetings with the commissioner since midnight. She answered on speaker. Walsh, I'm here with Rivera. Chen, we've got a situation. Walsh's voice sounded exhausted. The FBI is taking over the corruption investigation as of 6 a.m. tomorrow. But there's something else, we just got word that Tony Castellano was arrested an hour ago trying to cross into Canada. My heart jumped. They caught him? Not exactly. He turned himself in to federal agents in Buffalo. Claims he has information about police corruption that goes all the way to the deputy commissioner's office. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of my heart monitor. Tony was making a play, offering to expose the very corruption network he'd helped create in exchange for immunity or a reduced sentence. How high does this go, Captain? Chen asked quietly. Unknown. But Castellano's lawyer contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office 3 hours ago with a proffer letter. They're claiming Tony has documented evidence of payments to 47 officers across 6 precincts, including detailed records of which investigations were compromised. The group chat Morrison had mentioned. 47 members who've been sharing information, evidence, and probably taking money from organized crime figures like Tony. Sir, I said, my voice still weak but determined, I need to make a statement while everything's fresh. If Tony's talking to the feds, they need to know exactly what those officers did in that alley. Negative, Rivera. You're not talking to anyone until you're cleared by the medical team and have legal representation present. Walsh paused. The union's already claiming your undercover assignment was unauthorized and that you were acting as a rogue agent when you were injured. Chin shot to her feet. That's complete bullshit. Operation Nightfall was approved by Deputy Commissioner Harrison, who's currently under federal investigation for taking bribes from construction companies. See the problem? I felt like I was drowning all over again. The very people who'd authorized my undercover work were potentially corrupt, which meant Tony's defense team could argue that I wasn't a legitimate police officer conducting an authorized investigation. I was just a vagrant who'd gotten beaten up during a drug deal gone wrong. Rodriguez checked his tablet. It gets worse. Morrison's body cam shows him asking you repeatedly to identify yourself, and your responses were garbled due to your injuries. His attorney's claiming his client couldn't understand what you were saying. But the phone records. Circumstantial. Having Lieutenant Chen's number doesn't prove you're a detective. Could be explained dozens of ways. A new voice spoke from the doorway. Not dozens. Just one. We all turned to see a woman in an expensive suit holding a federal badge. FBI Special Agent Sarah Kim, according to her identification. Gentlemen, ladies, she said, stepping into the room. Detective Rivera, I'm glad you're alive to tell your story. Because Tony Castellano just gave us a very different version of last night's events, and frankly, his version makes you sound like the criminal. The FBI agent's words hit me like a physical blow. Through my pain medication haze, I struggled to focus on her face as she pulled out a digital recorder and set it on my bedside table. According to Mr. Castellano's statement, Agent Kim continued, settling into the chair Chin had vacated, you approached him 6 weeks ago claiming to be a private investigator working for his ex-business partner, Michael Torino. Ring any bells? My mouth went dry. Michael Torino was Vince's younger brother, the one who'd been skimming money from Tony's legitimate construction contracts before disappearing to Florida last spring. I'd learned about him during my surveillance, but I'd never claimed to be working for anyone. That's not true, I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. I was undercover NYPD, gathering evidence on money laundering through Castellano Construction's payroll system, yes. Kim consulted her notes. Except Tony claims you offered to sell him information about ongoing police investigations in exchange for a cut of his profits. Says you provided details about Operation Nightfall that could only have come from someone inside the department. Chin stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. Agent Kim, Detective Rivera has been working this case under my direct supervision for 14 weeks. Every contact with Castellano's organization was documented and approved by Deputy Commissioner Harrison, who as of 2 hours ago has been arrested for accepting over $300,000 in bribes from various construction companies, including Castellano's. Kim's expression remained neutral, but I caught the satisfaction in her voice. Hard to verify the legitimacy of operations authorized by a corrupt official. My heart monitor started beeping faster as the implications sank in. Harrison hadn't just been taking bribes, he'd been the one who'd personally approved my deep cover assignment. If he was corrupt, it meant my entire operation could be dismissed as unauthorized, making me just another criminal who got beaten up during a deal gone wrong. There's more, Kim continued, scrolling through her tablet. Castellano provided us with recordings of phone conversations between someone claiming to be Detective Rivera and various members of his organization. The voice analysis is interesting. She pressed play on a small device, and my own voice filled the hospital room. Tony's getting suspicious about the Tuesday meetings. You need to move the ledgers to a different location before next week. I stared at the device in horror. Those words had never left my mouth. The voice was mine, but the message was completely fabricated. Deep fake technology, Rodriguez said grimly. Someone with access to your voice recordings created fake conversations. Or, Kim suggested, Detective Rivera actually made those calls and is now claiming they're fabricated to cover his tracks. Wouldn't be the first time an undercover officer went native and started working both sides. Chen's fists clenched at her sides. You're suggesting one of my detectives turned dirty during his assignment. I'm suggesting that when 47 police officers are taking money from organized crime figures, we have to question everything. Including the loyalty of officers who spent months embedded with those same criminals. The room fell silent except for the mechanical sounds of my medical equipment. Through the fog of painkillers and exhaustion, I tried to piece together how Tony had managed to construct such an elaborate frame-up. The fake recordings, the planted evidence, the coordination with corrupt officers, it was sophisticated beyond anything I'd expected from a mid-level money launderer. Kim leaned forward, her voice taking on a more personal tone. Detective Rivera, I've seen good cops get lost in deep cover operations. The line between pretending to be a criminal and actually becoming one gets blurred. If you made some questionable choices during your assignment, now's the time to come clean. I never betrayed my oath, I said firmly, each word causing fresh pain in my chest. Tony Castellano is lying to save himself, and those officers left me to die because they thought I was worthless trash. Maybe. Or maybe 3 veteran officers recognized a dirty cop when they saw one. Agent Kim's accusation hung in the air like poison gas. I could see doubt flickering across Rodriguez's face, and even Chen looked shaken by the FBI's twisted narrative. The fake recordings had done their job, planted just enough uncertainty to make everyone question what they thought they knew about me. Agent Kim, I said, fighting through the fog of painkillers to think clearly, if I was working for Tony, why would his crew beat me nearly to death? Why would he come back to the alley to finish the job? According to Castellano's statement, you got greedy. Started demanding a bigger cut of the profits and threatened to expose the whole operation if he didn't pay up. Kim scrolled through her tablet again. He claims the beating was meant to scare you into backing down, not kill you. Says his people used minimal force to send a message. Minimal force? Chin exploded. He's got 3 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and internal bleeding that nearly killed him. Consistent injuries for someone who resisted during a disciplinary action, Kim replied coldly. Mr. Castellano expressed genuine remorse that his associates were more aggressive than intended. Rodriguez checked his phone and grimaced. Chen, we've got another problem. Morrison just posted bail, and his first stop was Channel 7 News. He's giving an interview about systemic corruption in the department at 6 a.m. My blood pressure spiked, setting off alarms on the heart monitor. Morrison was going public, spinning himself as a whistleblower who tried to help an injured man despite suspecting he was a dirty cop. The media would eat it up: corrupt police, organized crime, a detective who might have gone rogue during his assignment. Turn on the TV, I wheezed, pointing toward the wall-mounted screen. Chen grabbed the remote and flipped to Channel 7, where Morrison's face filled the screen under a banner reading, Police Corruption Scandal Exposed. He looked fresh-faced and earnest, nothing like the cruel officer who'd stepped on my wrist while I bled out. Truly believed we were dealing with a dangerous individual who was impersonating a police officer, Morrison was saying, his voice full of manufactured concern. When someone shows up in an alley, beaten and bloody, claiming to be an undercover detective but looking like they haven't showered in months, you have to be suspicious. The interviewer leaned forward. But Officer Morrison, didn't you have ways to verify his identity? Of course, and we tried. But Detective Rivera, if that's really who he was, couldn't provide coherent answers to basic questions. His speech was slurred, his story kept changing, and frankly, he smelled like alcohol and other substances. I tried to sit up, ignoring the screaming pain in my chest. That's a lie. I gave them my badge number, Chen's contact information, specific details about the operation. Details that Tony Castellano claims he fed to you during your alleged partnership, Kim interrupted. Information you could have used to make your cover story more convincing. On the TV screen, Morrison continued his performance. Look, I've been a police officer for 4 years. I know the difference between a legitimate undercover operation and someone trying to avoid consequences for criminal activity. The fact that Detective Rivera was found in an alley after a drug deal gone wrong, with Tony Castellano's phone number in his contacts. That raises red flags. Chen muted the television, her face pale. They're destroying him on live TV. By the time this interview ends, public opinion will be completely poisoned against Marcus. Rodriguez's phone buzzed with another update. It gets worse. The district attorney's office just announced they're reviewing every case involving the 47 officers in Morrison's group chat. That includes 3 major prosecutions scheduled for next month, all potentially compromised. How much money are we talking about? I asked, dreading the answer. Preliminary estimates suggest over $2 million in bribes distributed across the network over 18 months, Kim replied. Castellano claims you personally received $47,000 for providing information about pending raids and surveillance operations. The number was so specific, so carefully chosen. Not large enough to seem unbelievable, but substantial enough to suggest serious corruption. Tony had planned this frame-up meticulously, right down to the dollar amounts that would make headlines. Agent Kim, Chen said quietly, you realize that if Rivera was actually working with Castellano, he would never have missed a scheduled check-in last night. A corrupt cop wouldn't have triggered the welfare check that exposed this whole mess. For the first time, Kim looked uncertain. Unless he was planning to disappear with his cut of the money. The missed check-in could have been his exit strategy. But I could see her considering Chen's point. The timeline didn't quite work for Tony's version of events. A corrupt detective planning to run wouldn't have put himself in a position to be beaten unconscious in an alley. There's something else, I said, remembering a crucial detail through my medication haze. Tony mentioned the warehouse safe combination, March 15, 2010. His daughter's birthday. I only learned that information 3 days ago by following him to her birthday party. If I was working with him for weeks, why would I need to conduct surveillance to learn basic family information? Kim made a note, but her expression remained skeptical. Could be explained as operational security. Even corrupt partnerships require compartmentalized information. On the muted television, Morrison was shaking hands with the interviewer, his performance complete. The damage was done. By evening news, the story would be about a detective who might have gone dirty during his undercover assignment, protected by supervisors who were themselves under investigation. The truth was becoming secondary to the narrative, and Tony Castellano had proven himself a master storyteller. Agent Kim's phone rang, interrupting the toxic cloud of accusations hanging over my hospital room. She stepped away to answer, and I caught fragments of her conversation, DNA evidence, inconsistent with 24 hours for lab results. When she returned, her expression had shifted slightly. Not friendlier, but more cautious. Detective Rivera, she said, settling back into her chair, I need to ask you about something specific. Tony Castellano claims you met with him personally at Gino's restaurant on September 12 to discuss your arrangement. Says you ordered the veal marsala and talked for 2 hours. My heart jumped. September 12th. I remembered that date perfectly because it was the day I'd been staked out across the street from Gino's, photographing everyone who entered and left. I'd been positioned in an abandoned storefront from 11 a.m. to 9 p.m., documenting Tony's meeting with City Councilman Robert Hayes. Agent Kim, I was never inside Gino's restaurant. On September 12th, I spent 10 hours conducting surveillance from the old mattress store across the street. I have photographs of Tony entering at 12:47 p.m. with Councilman Hayes, and I documented every person who went in or out of that restaurant. Kim's eyebrows rose slightly. You have photographs? Stored on a secure server that only Lieutenant Chen and Captain Walsh can access. Time-stamped, GPS tagged, the works. I looked at Chen desperately. The surveillance photos from Operation Nightfall, they're backed up on the department's encrypted cloud system. Chen was already pulling out her phone. Walsh authorized remote access for critical evidence preservation. If Marcus was conducting surveillance across the street while Tony claims they were having dinner together, then one of them is lying, Kim finished. She made another note, and I caught something in her voice, the first hint that maybe she was starting to question Tony's version of events. Rodriguez checked his tablet again. There's something else. The lab rushed preliminary analysis on the blood evidence from the alley. Marcus, your blood was found in a pattern consistent with someone being beaten while on the ground, but there's also evidence of a second altercation. Second altercation? Chen asked. Fresh blood that doesn't match Rivera's DNA. Someone else was bleeding in that alley within hours of Marcus being found there. My mind raced through the possibilities. When Tony's crew came back to the alley, maybe one of the corrupt officers tried to back out. Could have been an argument, someone getting punched. Or, Kim suggested, it could support Castellano's claim that you were injured during a business dispute that escalated beyond what anyone intended. But I could see her conviction wavering. The DNA evidence, the surveillance photos, the timeline inconsistencies, Tony's carefully constructed narrative was starting to develop cracks. Chen's phone buzzed with a message. She read it quickly, and her expression brightened for the first time in hours. The surveillance photos from September 12th are authenticated and intact, she announced. Marcus documented Tony Castellano entering Gino's restaurant at 12:47 p.m. with Councilman Hayes. The photos show him inside the restaurant from across the street, which means he couldn't have been having dinner with Tony at the same time. Agent Kim stood up abruptly, her phone already in her hand. I need to make some calls. Detective Rivera, don't speak to anyone else about this case until I get back. As she left the room, I realized that Tony's overconfidence might have been his downfall. He'd gotten so clever with his fabricated evidence that he'd forgotten about the real evidence I'd been collecting all along. The truth was still buried under layers of corruption and lies, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I could see a path to exposing it. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Agent Kim returned to my hospital room at 7 a.m., accompanied by a federal prosecutor I didn't recognize and carrying a thick manila folder. Detective Rivera, she said, her tone noticeably different from yesterday's hostility, we need to discuss some new developments. The surveillance photos you mentioned? They've opened up a much bigger investigation than anyone anticipated. She spread several photographs across my bedside table. The images showed Tony entering Gino's restaurant on September 12th, but in the background of one shot, I could clearly see a familiar figure, Deputy Commissioner Harrison, entering through a side door at 1:15 p.m. You photographed a meeting between Tony Castellano and Deputy Commissioner Harrison, the prosecutor said, introducing himself as Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen, no relation to my lieutenant. A meeting that Harrison denied under oath yesterday during his federal interrogation. My pulse quickened despite the pain medication. I documented everyone who entered that restaurant during my 10-hour surveillance. Harrison wasn't on our list of suspected contacts. That's because he wasn't supposed to be there, Agent Kim replied grimly. According to phone records we seized this morning, Harrison called Tony at 11:30 a.m. on September 12th using a burner phone purchased with cash. The call lasted 6 minutes, long enough to arrange an emergency meeting. Lieutenant Chen leaned forward. Emergency meeting about what? About you, Detective Rivera, AUSA Chen said, consulting his notes. Cell tower data shows Harrison's burner phone was actively pinging towers near your known surveillance locations for 3 weeks prior to September 12th. We think he was tracking your movements and feeding information to Castellano's crew. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. The deputy commissioner hadn't just authorized my undercover assignment, he'd been sabotaging it from the beginning, using my own position reports to help Tony stay one step ahead. How long has Harrison been on Tony's payroll? I asked, my voice hoarse with anger. Financial analysis suggests at least 2 years, Agent Kim replied. But here's where it gets interesting. Harrison's bank records show a payment of $50,000 on September 13th, one day after your surveillance photos were taken. We think Tony paid him specifically to eliminate the threat you represented. Eliminate? Chen's voice was sharp with alarm. Not necessarily kill, AUSA Chen clarified quickly. But certainly discredit, transfer, or otherwise neutralize. The beating you received might have been Plan B when Harrison couldn't find a bureaucratic way to end your investigation. Agent Kim pulled out another document. There's more. Morrison's body camera footage has been enhanced by our technical team. We found something the original investigators missed, a brief moment where he looks directly at his phone screen while you're bleeding out. The reflection in a puddle shows him reading a text message. She handed me a magnified screenshot. The text was barely visible but legible, keep him quiet until cleanup crew arrives. Harrison sends regards. My blood turned to ice. Harrison hadn't just been feeding information to Tony, he'd been actively coordinating with corrupt officers to cover up the attempted murder of a detective under his own command. How many officers are involved? Chen asked the question I was afraid to hear answered. Current count is 63 across 8 precincts, AUSA Chen replied. Morrison's group chat was just the tip of the iceberg. Harrison had been building a network of compromised officers for over 3 years, using them to protect various criminal operations in exchange for monthly payments. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. Chen, we've got a problem. Morrison just disappeared. Failed to report for his scheduled interview with Internal Affairs this morning, and his apartment's been cleaned out. Agent Kim cursed under her breath. Cleanup crew. Tony's people are eliminating loose ends before they can testify. The scope of the corruption was staggering. What had started as a money laundering investigation had uncovered a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the police department. And I'd been the unwitting catalyst who'd exposed it all by refusing to die quietly in that alley. Agent Kim, I said, struggling to sit up despite the pain, if Harrison's been tracking my movements for weeks, he knows about every safe house, every contact, every piece of evidence I've gathered. The entire Operation Nightfall case file is compromised. Which is why we're moving you to federal protection as soon as the doctors clear you for transport, she replied. Tony Castellano might be in custody, but Harrison's still free and desperate. You're the only witness who can directly connect him to the conspiracy. Through my hospital window, I could see unmarked federal vehicles positioning themselves around the building. The war between truth and corruption was escalating, and I was about to become the primary target. 2 weeks later, I sat in a federal courtroom wearing my dress blues for the first time in 4 months, watching Deputy Commissioner Harrison's face crumble as Agent Kim played the enhanced audio from Morrison's body camera. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal prosecutors, and dozens of police officers, some there to support justice, others to see how deep the corruption charges would cut. Please tell the court what you heard in that alley on September 23rd, AUSA Chen said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. I leaned toward the microphone, my ribs still aching but my voice strong. I heard Officer Patterson actually laugh, when I told them I was bleeding internally. Officer Morrison said, and I quote, one less problem on the streets. Maybe he'll learn to stay in his own neighborhood next time. Harrison's defense attorney objected, but Judge Martinez had already heard the enhanced audio recordings. The jury had seen the body camera footage of 3 sworn officers stepping over my bleeding body while making jokes about worthless junkies. No amount of legal maneuvering could explain away 47 minutes of documented cruelty. Detective Rivera, AUSH, and continued, what happened when Deputy Commissioner Harrison's text message arrived? Morrison read it aloud to the others, keep him quiet until cleanup crew arrives. Harrison sends regards. That's when I realized this wasn't negligence, it was attempted murder orchestrated by my own commanding officer. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Harrison's wife left through the side exit, unable to watch her husband's disgrace any longer. In the gallery, I spotted Lieutenant Chin nodding grimly as the full scope of the betrayal became clear to everyone present. Agent Kim took the witness stand next, methodically presenting 2 years of financial evidence. Harrison had received $340,000 in bribes from Tony Castellano's network. Patterson had taken $85,000. Morrison, despite being the youngest, had still managed to collect $23,000 over 8 months. 63 officers in total, their bank records laid bare for the jury to examine. The defendant used his position as deputy commissioner to sell police intelligence, compromise active investigations, and ultimately order the attempted murder of Detective Rivera when his undercover work threatened the conspiracy, Agent Kim testified. This wasn't corruption, it was organized crime operating within the police department itself. The defense tried to paint me as a rogue detective who'd gone native during his assignment, but the surveillance photos from September 12 destroyed that narrative. Time-stamped images showing me positioned across the street from Gino's restaurant while Harrison claimed I was inside having dinner with Tony Castellano. GPS data from my phone confirming my location. Cell tower records proving Harrison had been tracking my movements for weeks. When Tony Castellano took the witness stand as a federal cooperator, even his own lawyer looked disgusted. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Tony detailed how Harrison had first approached him in 2021, offering to protect his money laundering operation for $25,000 per month. How the network of corrupt officers had grown from 3 to 63. How they'd planned to let me die in that alley, then claim I'd been a dirty cop all along. Why did you agree to participate in this conspiracy? The prosecutor asked. Tony's answer was chilling in its simplicity, because Deputy Commissioner Harrison convinced me that half the police department was already for sale. He said cops like Rivera, the honest ones, were dinosaurs who'd be extinct within 5 years. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the 4 women stood with a stack of verdict forms 2 inches thick. Guilty on all counts for Harrison. Guilty for Patterson and Morrison, though Morrison would never serve his sentence, his body had been found in the Hudson River 3 days after he tried to flee. Even in federal custody, Tony's reach had been long enough to silence the officer who could have provided the most damaging testimony. As the judge read Harrison's sentence, 25 years in federal prison, I thought about that night in the alley. About bleeding out on dirty concrete while 3 officers decided my life was worthless. About how close they'd come to being right. The headlines the next morning told the story, police corruption network exposed after detectives' near-death experience, and 63 officers indicted in largest NYPD scandal in decades. But for me, the real victory wasn't the convictions or the prison sentences. It was the knowledge that no one else would bleed out in an alley while cops laughed at their suffering. The badge means something again, because we'd proven that even the worst corruption couldn't kill what that shield truly represents. Sometimes you have to almost lose everything to remember why it was worth protecting in the first place.